The question has to be raised: are these people really concerned about human life? And the answer is obviously not, because if they were really concerned, if Mr. 1000 was really concerned about preserving a human life, then the first thing that he would condemn would be native culture, because for millennia prior to the arrival of the Europeans, before the white man ever stepped foot on this continent, the tribalists that inhabited this part of the world were killing each other.
Why? Why is the first thing we do is condemn native culture? Those damn natives. If they hadn't have been so, we wouldn't have had to wipe them off the face of the planet. The logic escapes me. But let's just consider the two examples here. On the one hand, we have, according to Qtronman, and there's truth to this, we have native tribes that for millennia were warring with each other. And yet their populations and civilizations were flourishing across the continents. And then they're introduced to a superior culture, and within a few hundred years, they're nearly wiped off the planet. Now, let me just point out, wars of the kind fought by natives, pretty standard fare across much of the planet for most of human civilization. It's not to say it's good or bad, it's just a reality. As far as the magnitude of wars, nothing unusual. And certainly Europeans were well versed in warfare. But the wholesale destruction of the indigenous people of this continent is on a level of magnitude beyond anything the native people had ever seen. And I can't help but ask, if you were introduced to a superior culture, wouldn't you live and flourish?
See, but they don't care about the fact that natives were killing each other before the white.
We've all heard this argument before, most recently with the war in Iraq. Those of us who opposed the war in Iraq were said to, by opposing the war, we were somehow in support of Saddam Hussein and his Ba'athist regime. It presents a typical either-or fallacy. Qtronman basically does the same thing here. By opposing the genocide of the colonists against the natives, we're either in support or at least, complicit in the brutality exercised at times by the native population. It misses the entire point, and that is, where does our responsibility lie? And our responsibility obviously lies with what we do. The truth is, we can care about it all. We can care and be concerned about the sometimes brutal acts carried out by natives, and we can also be concerned and alarmed by the wholesale genocide of entire people that was carried out by our ancestors. There's room to care about it all.
What they care about is that there was this superior culture that arrived and then basically, for all intents and purposes, wiped out this inferior culture.
Sounds so sterile, doesn't it? This superior culture came in and it just wiped out this other culture. Culture, this doesn't really tell you what happened, does it? That a group of people who wanted access to this land and its resources and its bounty set out to murder and destroy a whole other group of people, brutally, consciously set out to do it. Not because they were superior. That's ridiculous.
The Nazis had this idea of a superior versus an inferior race. Well, objectivists don't have racism. There's no racism in objectivism, but the very fact that objectivists hold the idea of there's something being a superior culture, gradations among cultures and rating and ranking cultures as inferior and superior, this to them is an affront. It's a moral affront because, they make all these videos against hierarchy. You can't grade things. You can't rate things. You can't.
I do have a problem with the idea of inferior and superior culture, but certainly not in the terms raised by Qtronman. Here he just seems confused by the terms he's using. It's not a moral affront to me, or any anthropologist who studies culture in a serious way. It's simply problematic on a number of levels. Culture covers so many different things that it's hard to imagine how we would quantify or come to rank these in any certain order. You can say the same thing about nations. I don't think one can easily quantify nations and rank them A, B, C, D. Certainly we can take certain aspects and say, well, that's a little better than this, but to quantify the whole thing seems just problematic. It's not, morality doesn't even come into question here. It is true that anarchists tend to make videos against hierarchy, but here Qtronman basically conflates things. Certainly there is a definition for hierarchy in the way that he uses it, and that we'd order things, give certain values to things. But that's certainly not the way in which anarchists oppose hierarchy. Anarchists oppose hierarchy in the sense of a ladder of power. That is, specifically illegitimate power. A power over individuals, power by institutions and authorities that is unjustifiable. So he just conflates things here. We're certainly not we certainly don't object to valuing and judging things.
The European colonialists were superior to the natives that lived here. They don't make an argument because there's no argument to make, right? You can't win that argument. So
let me begin with a quote from one of my favorite political analysts and authors, Michael Parenti. This is from Imperialism 101. What cultural supremacy could be claimed by the Europeans of yore? From the 15th to 19th centuries, Europe was ahead in a variety of things, such as the number of hangings, murders, and other violent crimes, instances of venereal disease, smallpox, typhoid, tuberculosis, plagues, and other bodily afflictions, social inequality and poverty, both urban and rural, mistreatment of women and children, and frequency of famines, slavery, prostitution, piracy, religious massacres, and inquisitional torture. Those who claim the West has been the most advanced civilization should keep such achievements in mind. More seriously, we might note that Europe did enjoy a telling advantage in navigation and armaments. Muskets and cannon, Gatling guns and gunboats, and today missiles and helicopter gunships and fighter bombers have been the deciding factors when West meets East and North meets South. Superior firepower, not superior culture, has brought the Europeans and Euro-North Americans to positions of supremacy that today are still maintained by force, though not by force alone. Were they culturally inferior? In many parts of what is now considered the Third World, people developed impressive skills in architecture, horticulture, crafts, hunting, fishing, midwifery, medicine, and other such things. Their social customs were often far more gracious and humane and less autocratic and repressive than anything found in Europe at the time. Of course, we must not romanticize these indigenous societies, some of which had a number of cruel and unusual practices of their own. But generally their peoples enjoyed healthier, happier lives with more leisure time than did most of Europe's inhabitants. If Qtronman is honest, he will admit that it is standard for imperialists to claim superiority. There's nothing unique about his claim. The Babylonians, Persians, Romans, Germans, and English, just to name a few, all claimed superiority, as they went around plundering, killing, and brutalizing people around the world. Culture, of course, is a rather recent concept, and one that is perhaps more nebulous than even race itself. But let's examine it nonetheless. What is meant by culture? There's certainly no easy term to define, and each of the social sciences has their own interpretation, but let me just pull something from Wikipedia, just give you an idea of flavor. In the 20th century, culture emerged as a concept central to anthropology, encompassing all human phenomena that are not purely the result of human genetics. Specifically, the term culture in American anthropology had two meanings. One, the evolved human capacity to classify and represent experiences with symbols and to act imaginatively and creatively. And two, the distinct ways that people living in different parts of the world classified and represented their experiences and acted creatively. This is from Wikipedia, but it gels with what I learned in anthropology. It's basically a pretty nebulous concept. All human phenomena that are not purely the result of human genetics. The question you have to ask yourself is, by what criteria would you possibly establish that one culture was superior to another, not just different? The only criteria we've seen Qtronman give is that we were better able to murder and kill natives. So, if Western culture gave rise to superior firepower, maybe Qtronman has an argument. The only problem is that the vast majority of natives were not killed by superior European weapons, but by our diseases. No, I'm not talking about the smallpox blanket story you're all familiar with. Just coming in contact with Europeans and their diseases wiped out more Native Americans than any intentional act by the Europeans. But remember, that's not a cultural superiority. That's genetics. That's the result of Europeans living through the dirty, filthy conditions they existed in for millennia and developing antibodies to these diseases. So even from a cultural standpoint, Qtronman's argument falls flat.